In the last week of December, 1404, an old man climbed onto a horse in the city he loved more than any place on earth, and he did not look back. He was somewhere around 68 years old, though nobody, including him, seems to have been entirely sure. He had a wrecked hip and a right arm that never worked properly after an old wound, injuries so old and so famous that an entire dynasty of European map makers, chroniclers, and eventually Christopher Marlowe would remember him by the wound rather than the name. Timur, Tamerlane, Timur Timur the Lame. He was, by this point in his life, the most feared man between the Great Wall of China and the gates of Vienna. He had leveled Baghdad. He had turned the heads of Isfahan's dead into architecture. He had ridden into Delhi and taken it apart stone by stone and person by person. He had captured an Ottoman sultan, the ruler of the empire that would one day take Constantinople, and, if the more theatrical chroniclers are to be believed, used him as a footstool. There was no one left in his known world who could stand against him in the field. He had spent nearly 40 years proving that, one city at a time. And so, in the winter of 1404, with nothing left to prove on the continent he already owned, Timur did the only thing left that made sense to a man who had built his entire identity around being unconquerable. He decided to conquer China. This was not a small ambition. The Ming dynasty was the largest, richest, most populous state on the planet. Timur assembled what chroniclers describe as an army of 200,000 men, an almost unbelievable number for a winter campaign across the frozen steppe, and set out from Samarkand in the depths of a Central Asian winter so severe that, according to the accounts, men and horses froze where they stood. He never got there. Somewhere around Otrar, a city on the Syr Darya River in what is now southern Kazakhstan, the campaign stopped. Not because of an enemy, not because of a defeat. It stopped because Timur, the man who had personally outmarched, outmaneuvered, and outlasted every rival claimant to Genghis Khan's shattered inheritance, got sick and died in his tent in February 1405. There is something almost unbearably human about this ending, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we go anywhere else in this story. Here was a man who had spent his entire adult life turning uncertainty into conquest, who had never lost a major campaign, who had outthought and outfought Persian shahs, Mongol khans, Delhi sultans, and Ottoman emperors, and in the end, the only enemy that beat him was the one no army could outflank. His body simply stopped. The war machine he had spent 4 decades building, the largest concentration of Eurasian military force outside of China itself, sat frozen on the steppe with nowhere to go, and no one left to give it orders. Within a few years, his empire, the empire that had stretched from the Bosphorus to the edges of India, would be tearing itself apart in a succession war among his own descendants. The China campaign, the culmination of everything, would simply be abandoned, its 200,000 men trickling back to garrisons and home provinces, the great final conquest of Timur's life reduced to a footnote about a march that never finished. So here's the question this story is really about, the one thing worth carrying with you through everything that follows. What was all of it for? What does a man spend a lifetime building an empire in order to prove? And when the empire depends entirely on one unkillable seeming man's ability to keep winning, keep marching, keep terrifying, what happens to everyone underneath him the moment he can't? To answer that, we have to go back. Not to the throne room in Samarkand, but to a much smaller, much more precarious place. A fractured, lawless province of a dying Mongol empire, where a young man with a bad leg and no royal blood was about to figure out that the old rules of who got to rule the world were no longer being enforced by anyone. Here's something that rarely makes it into the popular image of Timur as an unstoppable world-conquering machine. He was born into chaos, not power. He wasn't a prince. He wasn't heir to anything. He was born around 1336 near a town called Kesh. modern Sharisabs in Uzbekistan, in a region called Transoxiana, and the empire he was technically a subject of was already, functionally, dead. To understand why that mattered, you need to understand what had happened to the Mongol world in the century since Genghis Khan. The empire Genghis built had been the largest contiguous land empire in human history, but empires that large don't stay unified. They fracture along the seams of geography and inheritance. By the time Timur was a teenager, the piece of that empire that covered his homeland, the Chagatai Khanate, had splintered into competing factions. There were khans, but they were often puppets. There were tribal warlords who held the actual power. There was no single authority anyone could appeal to, no clear chain of command, no rulebook anyone was actually following. If you want to understand what this felt like on the ground, imagine growing up in a place where the official government exists mostly on paper, where the people who actually control the roads, the grazing lands, and the tax revenue are local strongmen who answer to no one but themselves, and where the only thing that reliably determines whether you live like a lord or die in a ditch is whether you can gather enough armed men around you to make other people listen. That was Transoxiana in the 1340s and 1350s. It was not a kingdom. It was an opportunity wrapped in a warning. Timur belonged to the Barlas, a Turkicized Mongol tribe, meaning a group descended from Genghis Khan's original conquerors, but who had, over a century, adopted the language and much of the culture of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia. This detail matters more than it might seem to at first, because it defines the central problem of Timur's entire life. He had Mongol military tradition in his blood, but not Mongol royal blood in his lineage. And in the political logic of the post-Chinggisid world, that gap between having the tools of power and having the paperwork for power was everything. Here's the thing about the Mongol imperial system that Timur inherited. It ran on a kind of genetic legitimacy. Only descendants of Genghis Khan, the Chinggisids, were entitled to hold the actual title of Khan, the supreme ruler. This wasn't just tradition, it was load-bearing ideology. The entire Mongol claim to universal rule rested on the idea that heaven itself had chosen Genghis Khan's line to govern the earth. You could be the most brilliant general alive, the wealthiest warlord in the region, commanding tens of thousands of loyal soldiers, and none of it legally entitled you to call yourself Khan if you didn't have the right grandfather. This is the trap Timur was born into, and understanding how he escaped it is really the key to understanding everything he did for the rest of his life. He didn't try to break the rule. He found a way to make the rule irrelevant while pretending to honor it completely. Timur rose the only way a non-Chinggisid with ambition could rise in that world. Through raiding, through shifting alliances, through marriage, and above all, through being reliably, terrifyingly good at winning fights. He fought alongside other tribal factions, switched sides when it served him, took wounds, including, in a raid sometime in the 1360s, the injuries to his leg and right arm that would follow him for the rest of his life and give his enemies a nickname to sneer at him with. And slowly, methodically, built a personal following of loyal men who owed their position not to inherited status, but to him directly. And then, once he had enough of those men, he did something quietly brilliant. He married into a Chinggisid family, and he began installing puppet Khans, real legitimate descendants of Genghis Khan, as figurehead rulers, while keeping every actual lever of power in his own hands. He never called himself Khan. He called himself Amir, commander, prince, a title that let him rule an empire, while a ceremonial Chinggisid sat on a throne beside him, providing the sacred bloodline that Timur's own soldiers and his rivals still psychologically needed to believe in. It's worth pausing on how cynically effective this was. Timur wasn't fooling anyone about where the real power sat. But he understood something that a lot of purely military conquerors never grasp. Legitimacy is a story people need to tell themselves, and if you control the story, you don't need the crown. You just need someone standing near the crown who will do what you say. By the time he'd finished consolidating control over Transoxiana in the 1360s and 1370s, grinding down rival warlords one by one, absorbing their men, marrying into the right families, he wasn't just another regional strongman anymore. He held Samarkand, the region's great trading city, and he was already starting to think in terms most of his rivals never had. Not just who controls this valley, but who is the rightful heir to the entire Mongol world. That is an almost absurd ambition for a man with no royal blood and, at this point, a still modest territory. But absurd ambitions, backed by real armies, have a way of becoming history. And to make that ambition real, Timur needed something no tribal warband could give him, a military machine capable of operating not just as raiders, but as the instrument of an empire. Which brings us to the part of the point that made everything else possible. Because conquering half of Eurasia isn't a matter of bravery or ambition alone. It's a matter of engineering. It's tempting to picture Timur's army as an updated version of Genghis Khan's. Endless waves of horse archers sweeping out of the steppe. And there's truth in that image. The core of Timur's military DNA was pure Mongol steppe warfare, mobile cavalry, organized in the old decimal system inherited from Genghis Khan's reforms, where units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 nested inside each other like a machine built out of smaller machines, each with its own commander, each accountable up the chain. But the thing that actually made Timur different from most of the warlords he crushed on his way up wasn't the cavalry. It was everything he built around the cavalry. Consider the components: highly mobile horse archers to skirmish, harass, and probe. Heavy cavalry held in reserve to deliver the decisive shock at the moment an enemy line began to waver. Specialized units whose entire purpose was psychological. Designed not to kill, but to terrify, to make the idea of resistance feel suicidal before a single arrow was loosed. And, crucially, siege engineers, men Timur specifically recruited and retained from the conquered cities of Persia, the Middle East, and India, whose job was to make sure that no fortified city, however strong its walls, could simply wait Timur out. This last point deserves real attention because it's the piece that separates a conqueror from a raider. A raiding warband can terrorize the countryside forever without ever taking a walled city. Cities can just close their gates and starve the raiders out, or wait for winter. An empire builder has to be able to take cities reliably, on a schedule, because cities are where the wealth, the administrators, the craftsmen, and the tax base actually live. Timur understood this with total clarity, and he built an engineering corps specifically so that no city's walls, however thick, could function as a permanent refusal. And underneath all of it sat something that gets almost no attention in the popular imagination of a barbarian conqueror, but which Timur's contemporaries and later historians agree was maybe his single greatest military talent: logistics. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why did so many steppe conquerors before and after Timur burn out, stall, or collapse after a few decades, while Timur kept expanding methodically for nearly 40 years across some of the harshest and most logistically punishing terrain on the planet: deserts, mountain passes, the frozen approach to Otrar? Part of the answer is that Timur treated an army the way a modern general staff treats one, as a machine that needs fuel, and the fuel has to arrive on schedule or the machine stops, no matter how brave the men riding it are. He planned campaigns around seasons, not ambition. He built and relied on intelligence networks that told him before he committed tens of thousands of men to a campaign, where an enemy's defenses were thin, where the water sources were, which local factions could be bought or turned. He split his massive armies into smaller, independently mobile columns that could move faster and forage more easily than one enormous horde. And then, at the moment of battle, converge those columns with a timing that must have looked, to the people watching it happen to their own cities, like something closer to sorcery than warfare. This is worth dwelling on for a second, because it's the difference between a man who got lucky for 40 years and a man who built a system that made luck largely irrelevant. Divide to move fast. Gather intelligence to know exactly where to strike. Converge at the last possible moment so the enemy has no time to prepare a unified response. Bring engineers so that no wall is a real refuge. Repeat on schedule for 4 decades across 3 continents. It's a formula. And once you understand the formula, the terrifying part of Timur's biography stops being mysterious. It starts being almost mechanical, which in some ways makes it more unsettling, not less. This wasn't a berserker sweeping across the map on rage and momentum. This was a system deliberately built, relentlessly maintained, and pointed with total precision at one city after another. The first cities it was pointed at were the ones closest to home, and the closer those first targets were, the more personal, and in some cases, the more brutal, the stakes became. Because before Timur could dream of Delhi or Damascus, he had to finish a fight that was really about who got to call Central Asia their own. By the early 1370s, Timur had done something that very few figures in the chaotic post-Chagatai world had managed. He had actually won. Not just won a battle, but won the argument over who ran Transoxiana. Rival tribal leaders who had spent a decade jockeying for the same territory were dead, absorbed, or subordinated. And at the center of the territory he now controlled sat a city that would become, for the rest of his life and long after his death, the single clearest expression of what he thought an empire should look like. Samarkand. It's worth understanding what Samarkand meant to Timur, because the way he treated it tells you something the battle narratives alone don't. This was not a man who saw conquest as an end in itself. Every campaign that followed, every siege, every sacked city, every deported population of scholars and craftsmen, fed a single destination in his mind. Samarkand would become the proof, sitting in stone and tilework and garden design, that the boy from Kesh with no royal blood had built something greater than the Khans who'd been born to rule and had failed to hold their inheritance together. The stakes of controlling Transoxiana, in other words, weren't just about territory or tax revenue. They were existential for Timur's entire self-conception. This was the difference between being remembered as one more warlord who briefly held a valley and being remembered as the founder of something that would outlast him. Securing the homeland also meant confronting the other pieces of the old Mongol world that still had teeth. Most notably, the White Horde, one of the successor Khanates further north and east. These campaigns weren't glamorous compared to what came later, but they mattered enormously for a reason that's easy to miss. Every time Timur defeated another fragment of the old Chinggisid order, he was quietly building the case, to his own soldiers, to his rivals, and probably to himself, that he, an outsider to that bloodline, was the one actually capable of reassembling what Genghis Khan had left broken. There's a real tension sitting underneath these early wars that's worth naming directly. Timur spent his entire life reverent toward the idea of Chinggisid legitimacy, keeping puppet Khans, never claiming the title for himself, while simultaneously spending every year of his career proving, through military force, that bloodline didn't actually matter as much as capability. He wanted the myth's blessing without accepting the myth's rules. It's one of the great contradictions of his career, and it never really resolved. It just got papered over by success, campaign after campaign, for 40 years. With Transoxiana secured and the northern steppe neighbors dealt with, Timur now controlled something that mattered enormously for what came next. A secure, defensible home base with Samarkand as its beating heart, from which he could project power outward without worrying about being outflanked from behind. That security is what let him look south and west, toward Persia, toward some of the oldest, richest, most sophisticated cities in the Islamic world, and start asking a question that must have felt almost unbearably tempting to a man who had just spent 15 years clawing his way to the top of a fractured steppe province. What else is out there that I could take? Beginning in the late 1380s, Timur turned his newly consolidated war machine toward Khorasan and the heart of Persia. The timing wasn't accidental. The old Ilkhanid Mongol state that had once ruled Persia had fractured decades earlier into a patchwork of smaller successor dynasties. Exactly the kind of politically fragmented, militarily weaker landscape Timur had already proven. In his own homeland, he knew how to exploit. One city after another fell. Herat, one of the great intellectual centers of the Eastern Islamic world. Nishapur, an ancient city already famous for centuries as a hub of scholarship. Isfahan and Shiraz, jewels of Persian urban civilization, filled with poets, craftsmen, architects, and merchants whose networks stretched from India to the Mediterranean. Here is where the story of Timur stops being simply a tale of military conquest and becomes something much darker and more complicated, and it's worth slowing down for it, because this is one of the moments where the human stakes are almost too large to process in the abstract. Isfahan initially submitted to Timur without a catastrophic fight, but submission under Timur came with an implicit contract: obey, pay the tribute, accept the garrison, and the city survives. Rebel and the contract is void. Isfahan rebelled. What happened next is one of the most chilling episodes in the entire history of medieval conquest, and chroniclers of the period, writing, it's worth remembering, in a culture that was not squeamish about describing violence, record it with a kind of horrified specificity. After retaking the city, Timur's forces are said to have carried out a massacre on a scale meant not just to punish Isfahan, but to become a message broadcast to every other city in the region that might be considering the same choice. The chronicles describe towers built from the skulls of the dead, deliberately placed where they would be seen, a piece of architecture whose only purpose was communication. This is what happens when you decide my word isn't binding. Try for a moment to sit inside the calculation this represents, rather than just recoiling from it. From Timur's position, every city he besieged carried an enormous risk calculus. He could not garrison every conquered city with an occupying force large enough to guarantee permanent obedience. His empire was too vast, his core army too essential for the next campaign, for that to be sustainable. What he needed instead was something cheaper and more durable than a garrison: reputation. He needed every city in Persia to have heard in vivid and unforgettable detail exactly what rebellion cost, so that the threat alone would do the work that an occupying army otherwise would have had to do. This is, in the coldest possible terms, a strategy. It's also one of history's clearest illustrations of terror used as a deliberate instrument of state building rather than a byproduct of chaos. And it worked, in the narrow sense that it was designed to work. Cities that might otherwise have calculated that rebellion carried decent odds, instead calculated that it carried near certain annihilation, and many chose submission instead. But it's worth asking the question this story keeps circling back to. What did the people of Isfahan actually stand to gain by rebelling in the first place, and did they understand what they were risking? We don't have their voices. Not really. The sources we have were mostly written by court chroniclers, some in Timur's own orbit, some hostile. What we can reconstruct is the shape of the gamble. A city under an increasingly extractive tribute regime, facing a foreign emir it had submitted to under duress rather than genuine loyalty, and a population that may have believed, wrongly, catastrophically, that Timur's main army had moved on far enough that resistance was survivable. It wasn't. and the price of being wrong about that calculation was total. Here is the detail that makes Timur genuinely difficult to file into a simple moral category, and it's the detail this whole story keeps returning to. The same campaigns that produced the skull towers of Isfahan also produced, deliberately and systematically, a flow of the empire's most valuable people. Not to graveyards, but to Samarkand. Timur didn't just loot Persia's wealth, he looted its talent. Architects, poets, scholars, craftsmen, tile makers, calligraphers, the people who had made cities like Herat and Isfahan into centers of civilization, were deported, often forcibly, back to Samarkand, where they were put to work building the monuments that would define Timur's capital and eventually the entire Timurid artistic tradition that flourished after his death. This is the duality that sits at the absolute center of who Timur was, and it's worth stating plainly rather than softening it. The same man, in the same campaign, in some cases in the same city, could order a massacre calculated to terrorize an entire region into submission and also carefully preserve and transplant the artisans whose skill he wanted for his own glory. Destruction and cultural appropriation weren't contradictory impulses for Timur. They were two tools in the same kit, deployed depending on what a given city at a given moment needed to teach the wider world. Persian bureaucratic tradition, administrative sophistication that Central Asian steppe culture simply hadn't developed on its own, got absorbed wholesale into how Timur's growing empire actually functioned day to day. Persian became the dominant language of court culture and administration. In other words, Timur crushed Persian political independence with terrifying violence, and simultaneously became so culturally dependent on Persian civilization that his own court began to run, administratively and artistically, on Persian terms. He conquered the body and was, in a real sense, absorbed by the mind. This is what would eventually flower, after his death, into what historians call the Timurid Renaissance. But that flowering only happened because of exactly this brutal, extractive, city-by-city transfer of skill and talent that ran alongside every campaign of destruction. It's not a case of, despite the violence, there was also beauty. It's closer too. The beauty was manufactured, in significant part, by the machinery of the violence. That's a much harder thing to sit with than a simple story of a barbarian who happened to also like architecture. With Persia broken to his will, Timur now had wealth, artisans, and a secure southern flank. But there was another Mongol successor state to the north that had once been his ally. And the man who ran it was about to make the mistake of thinking friendship with Timur meant something it never did. If there's a moment in Timur's career that plays out almost like a Greek tragedy, friendship curdling into rivalry, gratitude transforming into resentment, and both men eventually paying an enormous price for it, it's his relationship with Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was the Mongol successor state controlling the vast northern steppe territories stretching across southern Russia. A rival power structure to Timur's own and, crucially, one still headed by a legitimate Chinggisid Khan, which gave it a kind of symbolic authority Timur's puppet Khan arrangement could only imitate. Early in his career, Timur had actually helped Toktamish rise to power within the Golden Horde, backing him as a client and ally against internal rivals. A classic piece of Timurid statecraft, extending influence not through direct annexation, but through installing a grateful, dependent friend on a neighboring throne. It didn't stay that way. Once secure in his own position, Toktamish did something that must have felt, from Timur's perspective, like the ultimate betrayal. He turned on his former patron and began asserting independent ambitions, including raids into territory Timur considered his own sphere. Think about what was actually at stake here for both men, because it clarifies why the resulting wars were fought with such ferocity. For Toktamish, This was about proving to his own nobles, to the Chinggisid legitimacy he actually possessed and Timur didn't, that he was not simply a puppet ruling at the pleasure of a Turkic warlord from Transoxiana. Submission to Timur indefinitely would have meant permanent subordinate status for a man who held the one thing Timur himself could never legally claim: the bloodline. For Timur, the stakes were arguably even higher. If a former client could defy him and survive, the entire logic that held his sprawling, loosely centralized empire together, fear, reputation, the near mythical sense that resisting Timur was suicidal, would start to crack. He could not let this stand, not because of personal pride alone, but because the system of terror-based compliance he'd built across 3 regions depended on it never being shown to fail. The resulting conflict played out across a series of campaigns through the late 1380s and into the 1390s, and it reached its 2 decisive climaxes at the Battle of the Kondurcha River in 1391 and the Battle of the Terek River in 1395. Both battles were fought on a scale that dwarfed most of the engagements that had built Timur's reputation up to that point. Enormous cavalry armies maneuvering across open steppe, exactly the kind of terrain where the tactical sophistication Timur had spent decades refining could operate at full effect. Reconnaissance identifying weaknesses, mobile columns converging at the decisive moment, heavy cavalry held back until the enemy line was ready to break. Both times, Toktamish lost. Decisively. The consequences went far beyond the battlefield. After the Terek River victory in 1395, Timur didn't just defeat Toktamish's army. He pushed deep into Golden Horde territory and devastated its capital regions, dismantling much of the economic and political infrastructure that had made the Golden Horde a coherent, functioning state. This is a detail that often gets buried under the more famous chapters of Timur's career, but its consequences rippled forward for over a century. The Golden Horde's grip on Russia, which had held Russian principalities under various forms of tribute and subordination for generations, was permanently, structurally weakened. Historians studying the eventual rise of Muscovite Russian independence point back to this moment as one of the key hinges. Timur didn't conquer Russia, but by breaking the Golden Horde's back, he loosened the grip that had been holding Russian political development in check for generations, arguably clearing space for what would eventually become the Russian state we'd recognize centuries later. It's a strange kind of historical footnote to sit with, that a war fought entirely over Timur's wounded pride, and the survival of his own reputation for invincibility ended up several steps removed, reshaping the long-term trajectory of Eastern European history. Empires rarely fall for the reasons that seem to matter most in the room where the decision gets made. They fall or loosen their grip because of second- and third-order consequences that nobody in that room could have fully predicted. With his northern flank permanently subdued and his reputation for invincibility not just intact but enhanced, Timur now turned toward a target that must have seemed, on paper, almost irresistibly tempting. A fractured, wealthy, politically unstable kingdom on the other side of a mountain range and a desert, ruled by a dynasty that was busy tearing itself apart from the inside. By 1398, the Delhi Sultanate, the dominant Muslim power in northern India, ruled at that point by the Tughlaq dynasty, was a shadow of what it had once been. Decades of internal rebellion, succession disputes, and regional fragmentation had left it politically brittle, its authority over its own territory increasingly nominal the further you got from the capital. For Timur, watching from Central Asia, this must have looked almost too easy. And it's worth being honest about what actually motivated this campaign, because the framing matters. Unlike the Persian campaigns, which at least carried the pretense of restoring order to former Ilkhanate territory, or the wars against Toktamish, which had genuine strategic and personal stakes tied to Timur's reputation, The invasion of India reads in the historical record, much closer to opportunism plus plunder. India was fabulously wealthy. It was politically weak. And Timur, now in his 60s, had built a military machine that needed campaigns the way a fire needs fuel. An army this large, this specialized, this expensive to maintain, could not simply sit idle in Samarkand without beginning to fray at the edges through boredom, unpaid loyalty, and restless ambition among his own commanders. Timur's forces crossed the Indus River and drove toward Delhi with the same combination of speed and psychological warfare that had defined every major campaign of his life. Resistance, fragmented by the same internal Tughlaq divisions that had made India an attractive target in the first place, could not coordinate an effective unified defense. What happened at Delhi itself is one of the more genuinely horrifying chapters in Timur's biography, and it deserves to be described plainly rather than glossed over with the kind of vague language that lets historical atrocities slide past unexamined. Following the collapse of organized resistance, the city was subjected to what the chronicles describe as extensive, sustained looting and massacre, an urban catastrophe on a scale that broke down the basic functioning of one of the largest cities in the medieval world for years afterward. It's worth pausing here to ask a question that too often gets skipped in narratives that move briskly from battle to battle. What did this actually mean for the people living in Delhi in 1398? Not the sultan, not the nobility who might flee or negotiate terms, but the ordinary residents. The merchants, the artisans, the households with no political power and nowhere to run. For them, the arrival of Timur's army wasn't a chapter in a biography. It was the complete, sudden collapse of every ordinary structure of daily life. Markets, safety, family, the basic assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. Multiply that individual catastrophe across a city of hundreds of thousands, and you start to get a sense of the actual scale of what the sack of Delhi means underneath the tidy historical phrase. Timur's forces left with something almost unimaginable in scale. Gold, jewels, and, in a pattern we've now seen repeated across Persia, skilled artisans, forcibly relocated back to Central Asia to add their talents to the growing project of Samarkand's transformation into an imperial showcase. The campaign, brutal as it was, accomplished exactly what it set out to do from a purely strategic standpoint. It massively enriched Timur's empire and delivered an unmistakable demonstration to every ruler watching from Cairo to Beijing that no fortified kingdom, however wealthy or however far from Central Asia, was safe from Timur's reach if he decided to come for it. Having proven that even the Indian subcontinent could not resist him, Timur turned back west, toward the Mediterranean world, toward the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria, and toward a rising power that, unbeknownst to almost everyone at the time, was going to go on to reshape the entire map of the medieval and early modern world, the Ottoman Empire. And it's here, in the final great campaign of his life, that Timur would face not a fractured, declining kingdom ripe for the taking, but a genuine peer, a rival empire on the rise, led by a sultan who had never lost. Before Timur ever faced the Ottomans directly, he turned his attention to the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and much of Syria, one of the last great independent Islamic powers of the region, and a dynasty with its own proud military tradition stretching back to its origins as an empire built by former slave soldiers who had, famously, once stopped the Mongols themselves in the 13th century. Timur's Syrian campaign brought the same devastating combination of siege warfare and psychological terror that had already broken Isfahan and Delhi to two of the most celebrated cities in the Islamic world, Aleppo and Damascus. Both were captured and, to varying degrees, destroyed, cities whose prosperity and cultural significance had made them centers of trade, scholarship, and craft for centuries, absorbed into Timur's sphere through the now familiar mixture of conquest and imposed tribute. This campaign matters not just for its own brutal details, but for what it signaled. By the time Timur turned his attention to Anatolia and the Ottoman sultan, he had just finished demonstrating, once again, that there was essentially no city in the Islamic world capable of resisting him if he chose to come for it. Every ruler watching, including the man he was about to fight, understood exactly what kind of adversary they were dealing with. The Ottoman Sultan Timur was about to face, Bayezid I, was not some fading regional power ripe for the taking, the way Delhi's fragmented Tughlaq dynasty had been. Bayezid had earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed and ferocity with which he'd expanded Ottoman power across Anatolia and into the Balkans, and he had, only a few years earlier, crushed a massive Crusader army at the Battle of Nicopolis, a victory that had sent shockwaves through Christian Europe and cemented his reputation as an unstoppable rising force. In other words, for the first time in decades, Timur was about to face an opponent whose reputation for invincibility genuinely rivaled his own. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes the stakes of what followed. Every previous major campaign of Timur's life had, in one way or another, been a mismatch, a consolidated, disciplined, battle-tested war machine against fractured, declining, or overconfident opponents. The Ottomans under Bayezid were something different, a rising, ambitious, genuinely dangerous rival empire, commanded by a sultan who had never tasted real defeat. Two of the most formidable military reputations in the entire medieval world were about to collide, and both men understood, with total clarity, exactly what was actually at risk. For Bayezid, defeat wouldn't just mean a battlefield loss. It would mean the sudden, public collapse of the aura of invincibility his entire expansion strategy depended on. An aura that had let him bully and absorb rival Anatolian principalities without always having to fight them outright. For Timur, in his late 60s, this was arguably the single highest-stakes gamble of his entire career. A loss here, against a genuine peer, at the very end of his life, could unravel 4 decades of carefully constructed reputation in a single afternoon. The two armies met near Ankara in the summer of 1402, and what happened next has become one of the most consequential battles in medieval history. Not just for what it did to the two men directly involved, but for the way it reshaped the trajectory of an empire that would go on, within a few decades, to conquer Constantinople and reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Timur's forces won not through brute numerical superiority alone, but through exactly the combination of qualities that had defined his entire military career: superior mobility, tactical deception, and, critically, the ruthless exploitation of divisions and disloyalties within the Ottoman ranks. Bayezid's army, drawn from a rapidly assembled and not fully unified patchwork of Ottoman and vassal forces, had internal fractures that Timur's intelligence networks and battlefield tactics found and tore open at exactly the right moment. The result was a decisive, overwhelming Timurid victory. And then came the detail that has echoed through Western and Islamic historical memory alike for over 600 years. Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt, the man who had crushed a Crusader army and terrified Christian Europe, was captured alive. It's worth being careful here about separating documented history from the layers of legend that accumulated almost immediately afterward. Stories, some likely exaggerated or invented by later chroniclers and playwrights. Christopher Marlowe's dramatization is probably the most famous, depicting Bayezid caged like an animal and paraded before Timur's court, even used as a literal footstool. Whatever the precise historical truth of the most theatrical details, the core fact is undisputed and, on its own, staggering enough. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic and Christian worlds, ended his life as Timur's captive. The consequences for the Ottoman Empire were immediate and severe. Bayezid's sons plunged the empire into a succession crisis so severe that historians call the period the Ottoman Interregnum, roughly a decade of civil war between rival claimants that brought Ottoman expansion to a complete halt at precisely the moment it had seemed unstoppable. This detail deserves real weight because it's one of the great counterfactual hinge points of medieval history. The Ottoman Empire that emerged from the Interregnum went on, within another half-century, to conquer Constantinople in 1453 and become one of the dominant powers of the early modern world. But for roughly a decade after Ankara, that trajectory was thrown into genuine doubt. The empire's momentum broken, its unity shattered, its expansion into Europe paused, at a moment when a different outcome at Ankara might have let Bayezid's forces keep pushing into the Balkans uninterrupted. Timur, fighting a war that was fundamentally about his own reputation and the security of his empire's western flank, ended up, almost as a side effect, buying the fractured states of Christian Europe an entire decade of breathing room from Ottoman pressure. A decade that later historians have argued mattered enormously for how the following century of European and Ottoman history actually unfolded. Timur, for his part, was now unambiguously the dominant military figure of the entire Islamic and Central Asian world. There was no rival left standing who could plausibly challenge him. He had beaten fractured successor states, he had beaten a legitimate Chinggisid Khan, and now he had beaten a genuine rising peer empire and captured its sultan. And it's precisely at this moment of total, unrivaled dominance, with nothing left on his own continent to conquer, that Timur turned his attention to the one place left on earth large enough to be worthy of his ambition: China. Which brings us back, in a way, to where this story began. An old man on a horse, riding into a winter he wouldn't survive, chasing one final conquest that the only enemy strong enough to stop him, time itself, would make sure he never reached. But before we return fully to that ending, it's worth stepping back from the campaigns entirely and asking a different kind of question. What was Timur actually building underneath all this war? Because an empire this large doesn't run on battles alone. It runs, or doesn't, on ideas. One of the strangest and most revealing facts about Timur's entire career is this: he conquered more territory than almost any ruler in medieval history. He held life and death power over millions of people from the Bosphorus to the Ganges, and he never, not once, formally took the title of Khan. We've already touched on why. The ideological weight of Chinggisid bloodline in the post-Mongol world was simply too heavy for even Timur's staggering list of victories to overcome by force alone. But it's worth dwelling on what this meant in practice, because it shaped the entire structure of the empire he left behind. Timur styled himself Emir, commander, prince, a title of practical authority rather than sacred kingship. And he ruled for his entire career through Chinggisid figureheads, real descendants of Genghis Khan, installed as symbolic Khans, whose bloodline provided the ideological legitimacy that Timur's own conquests, however overwhelming, could never fully substitute for on their own. He positioned himself not as a usurper overthrowing the Mongol order, but as its restorer, the man putting the shattered pieces of Genghis Khan's legacy back together out of loyalty to that legacy, rather than ambition to replace it. It's a genuinely fascinating piece of political theater, sustained for nearly 4 decades, and it raises a question that historians still debate. Did Timur actually believe in the ideological framework he was operating within, or did he understand, with total cynicism, that it was simply the most efficient available tool for holding an empire built on raw force together? Probably the honest answer is that the two aren't as separable as we might want them to be. Ideologies that people find useful have a way of becoming things people also genuinely believe. especially when believing them costs nothing and helps everything. Whatever Timur privately believed about Chinggisid legitimacy, the practical structure of his empire reflected a deeper truth about what he'd actually built. It was not, in the modern sense, a centralized bureaucratic state. It was a network, a web of semi-autonomous regions governed by loyal military commanders, family members, and administrators, held together not by uniform law or shared institutions, but by tribute, military obligation, and personal loyalty to Timur himself. This is worth understanding clearly, because it's the detail that explains everything that happened to the empire the moment Timur died. A centralized bureaucratic empire, like the one the Ming dynasty ruled in China at the exact same historical moment, can survive the death of any individual ruler because power flows through institutions, offices, and administrative systems that continue functioning regardless of who sits on the throne. Timur's empire was almost the opposite. It was held together by personal relationships radiating outward from a single, extraordinary man. Regional commanders were loyal to Timur, not to an abstract office of supreme ruler that some successor could simply inherit and expect the same obedience toward. Persian administrative traditions did get absorbed into the day-to-day management of cities, taxation, and cultural institutions. This is part of why the Timurid dynasty that followed was able to function at all in places like Herat and Samarkand. But this administrative sophistication existed at the level of individual cities and provinces, not as a unifying imperial bureaucracy that could smoothly transfer authority from Timur to whichever descendant claimed to be his heir. In other words, Timur built an empire whose military and political structure was, in a very real sense, a direct extension of his own personal reputation and relationships. It was an extraordinarily effective structure for rapid conquest. It was an almost catastrophically fragile structure for succession. And yet, this is the part of the story that refuses to resolve into a simple verdict. The same extractive, terror-based, personally centered empire that Timur built also produced one of the great cultural flowerings of the late medieval world. Samarkand and, later, Herat became genuine centers of art, architecture, astronomy, and literature, drawing on the talent Timur had spent decades forcibly relocating from every corner of his conquests. The Timurid court patronized scholars, poets, and architects who blended Persian Islamic artistic traditions with Central Asian influences into something genuinely new. Intricate tile work, grand madrasas, monumental architecture that would go on to influence Islamic art and architecture for centuries, all the way down to structures as famous as the Taj Mahal, built generations later by Timur's own descendants in India. It's tempting, and in some ways comforting, to read this as evidence of redemption, to say that whatever violence built the foundation, something beautiful and worthwhile grew out of it in the end. But that framing lets both halves of the story off too easily. The honest version is harder and more uncomfortable. The cultural renaissance wasn't built despite the violence. It was built substantially out of the violence, out of forcibly relocated artisans, out of wealth extracted from sacked cities, out of a court culture funded by conquest. Whatever we think of the beauty that resulted, it doesn't erase or excuse the human cost that produced the raw materials. Both things are true at once, sitting uneasily next to each other, and that discomfort is really the honest emotional core of Timur's entire legacy. Which brings us, finally, back to that old man on a horse, riding out of the city he'd spent his whole life building toward a conquest he would never live to attempt. We know now what Timur, riding out of Samarkand in the winter of 1404, could not have known: that he would never see China, that his body would give out somewhere along the frozen road near Ottra, and that the empire he'd spent nearly 40 years assembling, an empire held together, as we've seen, not by institutions, but by personal loyalty to one irreplaceable man, would begin tearing itself apart almost immediately. His sons and grandsons plunged into a succession war, exactly the outcome that an empire structured around one man's personal relationships and reputation was always going to be vulnerable to the moment that man was gone. The political unity Timur had imposed across Central Asia, Persia, and the edges of the Caucasus and India fractured within a generation. There was no bureaucratic machine, no institutional continuity, no established mechanism for transferring the kind of authority Timur had held. Because that authority had never really been institutional in the first place. It had been personal, built on decades of victories that no descendant could simply inherit by right of blood. And yet, and this really is the strangest, most enduring part of the whole story, the Timurid dynasty didn't simply vanish. In fragmented, regional form, it persisted for generations, especially in Herat and Samarkand, continuing to shape Persian and Central Asian culture and governance long after the political unity of Timur's original conquests had dissolved. And one of his descendants, a prince named Babur, pushed out of Central Asia by rivals, eventually turned south into India and founded the Mughal Empire, meaning that the line running from a fatherless boy's rise through the chaos of the Chagatai Khanate eventually produced the dynasty that would build the Taj Mahal and rule the Indian subcontinent for centuries. So let's return, at the end, to the question this whole story has been circling. What was it all for? Timur spent his life converting uncertainty into conquest, illegitimacy into empire, and violence into architecture. He built a war machine so effective it never lost a major campaign in nearly 40 years, and an empire so personally dependent on his own singular reputation that it couldn't survive his death by more than a few years in any unified form. He massacred cities and rescued their artisans in the same campaigns. He refused a crown he could have taken by force and ruled through puppets whose only real function was to lend him a legitimacy his own extraordinary abilities could never quite manufacture on their own. Maybe the most honest way to understand Timur isn't as a single coherent figure, conqueror or patron, monster or builder, but as proof of how thoroughly those categories can occupy the same person, the same campaign, sometimes the same week. He is remembered, accurately, as one of history's great destroyers, responsible for suffering on a scale that's almost impossible to fully absorb. He is also remembered, just as accurately, as the man whose conquests financed and assembled the artistic and intellectual renaissance that shaped Islamic art and architecture for centuries afterward. Both of those things are true. Neither cancels the other out. And that, in the end, might be the real legacy of a man who died in the snow, one campaign short of finishing, having already built, and only barely failed to finish building, something that reshaped the world he left behind. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history because the past is never truly gone.